Okay, everyone. It's 5:30, and I guess we'll wait maybe just one more minute to see folks trickle in. But while we're waiting, I want to welcome everyone to this session. This is a roundtable hosted by my organization, the Global Engagement Center at the United States Department of State. And we've got a great roundtable of experts who have designed games that counter disinformation in innovative ways. Thanks to everyone who's joined us. Looks like we've got about 22 folks total on the line, and I'll get started right away so everyone can get right into it. So please, everyone, put yourself on mute, and we'll get to what's interesting about this, which is the games. So I'm Tyler. I'm a contractor supporting the U.S. Department of State's Global Engagement Center, the GEC. For those not familiar with the GEC, we are the State Department office tasked with directing the whole of government response to foreign propaganda and disinformation. We do things like holding tech challenges to foster innovation in the field of counter disinformation analysis and tools. And we also do tech demos to show government entities how those innovations work. So one of the most promising tech innovations that we have come across for countering disinformation is video games. We've seen how a well-designed game can help build players' defenses against disinformation and teach digital media literacy skills that are critical to navigating this crazy information space that we live in today. We at the GEC funded the development of one such game, which I'll be showing to you in a minute. But before I do, I just want to briefly introduce our all-star panelists, each of whom has developed games that tackle disinformation in the problem of disinformation and do digital media literacy in fun ways. First, we're going to hear from Dr. John Rosenbeek, who's a researcher at Cambridge University's Social Decision-Making Lab and chief creator of content used in a number of counter-disinformation games, including our game. Next, we're going to hear from Lindsay Grace, who is a video game designer and professor at the University of Miami, and the 2019 Games for Change Vanguard Award winner. Next, we have Dr. Susan Rivers, executive director and chief scientist at iThrive Games. Next, Dr. John Cook, a game designer and research fellow at the Climate Change Communication Research Hub at Monash University in Australia. Finally, we have James Vaughn, the founder of Endemic Creations and the hugely popular strategy game Plague Inc. So for those who have joined us, if you have any questions for me or for any of our other panelists, please type them in the chat box to the right or the Q&A box. We will leave plenty of time after our panelists have spoken and after they've answered my questions to field your questions. So before I hand over the mic to each of our all-star panelists in turn, I'm going to show you our game, which is called Harmony Square. And I'm going to describe a bit how it works. So without further ado, Okay, so that's our game. I appreciate you all being a captive audience to that video. It really articulates what the game's about better than I could. It was nominated for 2 awards at this year's Games for Change Festival, though sadly we were beaten by some other very deserving games. It's free to play on the web. It takes about 15 minutes. And the peer-reviewed research shows that it improves players' ability to spot disinformation and makes people less likely to share disinformation over social media. John Rosenbeek, who we're going to hear from in a minute, would be the best to answer any questions on the game's, on the academic methodology and how they evaluated the game's impact. If anyone wants to ask about that, please feel free to ask John by dropping a question in the box. Our embassies around the world are the real sort of conveyor of this game for us, our means of distribution. Our posts around the world use the game for public diplomacy purposes. They share it with schools, they share it via social media, and educators have reported that it's a great conversation starter for discussions about political disinformation. The next thing we're going to do at the GEC is we hope to make a new game to teach digital media literacy and combat disinformation. So hopefully next year you'll see our new game on the Games for Change main stage. So anyway, that's enough about the GEC. Let's hear next from John Rosenbeek. John, the floor is yours for a couple of minutes to introduce your game and what it's all about, and then I've got some questions for you. Thanks.
Thank you, Tyler. Let me share my screen for just a second. There it is. Everyone can see this, right? Please let me, because I can no longer see anyone on the screen, so you'll have to let me know verbally.
You're good.
Okay. Great, thank you. So what I wanted to discuss is sort of very briefly the reason why we created Harmony Square and a few other games the way we did. And that has to do with the definition of misinformation to a certain extent. So we talk a lot about fake news, disinformation, misinformation, etc., and the terms can get very, very muddled. But the problem is, I don't think that the distinction between true and false as the primary distinction that we use to determine whether content is harmful or should be acted upon is very useful. For example, this is an article from April 2021. A healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting a COVID-19 vaccine. The CDC is investigating why. Problem with this headline is, even though there is, like, all of the things that are in this headline are facts, right? Despite that, it is extremely misleading because it implies that the doctor died because of the COVID vaccine, which wasn't the case. So, which means that the factual veracity of a headline or sort of piece of social media content, or source cues, because this was published by the Chicago Tribune, which is a pretty legitimate news outlet, and intent, so the intent to deceive. Were they being intentionally deceptive or manipulative? We have no idea. All of these are difficult ways to define the problem. So the reason why we designed the games the way we did is because it allows us to focus on the techniques that are used to manipulate and deceive, which John Cook will talk about a bit more. This approach called a logic-based or technique-based inoculation, which you can pick up on. Like, if you know how these techniques work, you can recognize in the social media content that you see. So for that reason, we designed 3 games so far, with 2 more on the way. The first being Bad News, getbadnews.com. The second being Harmony Square, which Tyler already talked about, and Go Viral, which is about COVID-19 misinformation. And all of these games rely on pretty much the same principle and have peer-reviewed research behind them, in the sense that they serve as what you might call psychological vaccines against misinformation, in the sense that they improve people's ability to spot manipulation techniques, even in social media content that they've never seen before. So that's sort of the very brief introduction. Also, the point that I wanted to raise, that I'm very happy to discuss in more detail with everyone after the question round. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. So a question I had for you is, what skills does your experimental game radicalize teach players, and what is the evidence that it works?
Right. So Radicalize is a game about extremism. So it works pretty much following the same principles, Harmony Square and Bad News and Go Viral, in the sense that what the game teaches you is how to recognize the manipulation techniques that are often used by recruiters to recruit people into their organization, extremist organization. So, for example, isolating a person from their community, right? Like by sowing distrust about their close family members, let's say, or applying peer pressure to get them to commit an act of violence, right? After which there's a point of no return, because by that point you've committed a crime and someone might report you and so on. All of which there's a series of patterns that exist here that the game teaches you about. And we ran a study that we published this year in Behavioral Public Policy, which showed that playing this game actually really does improve quite significantly, and the effect sizes are quite large. People's ability to find these kinds of manipulation techniques and spot them and recognize them in direct communications, in this case, WhatsApp messages.
Secondly, John, sticking on the broader topic. So your game is unique in some ways. Your games are unique in some ways because your games have people simulate playing the bad guy. What considerations do serious game developers need to make when their game has players do something that's a little subversive, something that indulges in that kind of fun?
I mean, I guess don't take it too far is the consideration, right? Like if you're creating an environment where the mutual understanding between the game creator and the game player is that it's meant to be, you know, not an actual simulation of the world, right? But rather, it's a made up world in which things are allowed that aren't allowed in the real world. As long as that understanding is maintained, then the risk isn't very large. Much like there's a lot of research available on playing violent video games and whether that provokes aggressive behavior, and doesn't seem to. There's no strong evidence for that. And same here. I would say that like there is this concern, but we haven't observed it happen. And also at a theoretical level, the risk is quite small.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Okay, so next I'm going to give the floor over to Lindsay. I understand you're going to just show your game a bit, talk about it, and then I have a bunch of questions for you about it.
Sure.
Please go ahead, Lindsay.
Sure, great. So I'll just go ahead and do that right now. Should be showing. Can I get a verbal confirmation I'm good? Is it
good
showing?
to go?
Great, awesome. All right, so this is Factitious. Those of you who attended Games for Change in 2017 may recognize it. In short, it's kind of like Tinder for news. So it's a playable experience where you swipe right if you think it's real, a real article, looking at the example here, or fake. And then we give you some feedback and provide you some sort of playful interaction around that. I am not the only person involved in this, so I wanted to make sure to highlight those credits. I really think that this is kind of Maggie Farley's project, and then I just added my special sauce to make it an interesting and effective game design. So if you want more context for the game, I strongly suggest that you watch our 2017 Games for Change video. Basically, the title's here, Improving News Through Game Design. And one of the things I think that's important to this particular discussion is just recognizing how much press and interest this particular project got. Because the cool thing for us was that we got so many eyes on these articles. So we got more than 1 million plays. And if you're unfamiliar with the core concept here, for the last couple of years, I've really been working on versions of playable polling systems or human computation games. These are very light versions of human computation games, but the idea is to put a problem in front of a lot of people and then understand how they're perceiving the data that you put in front of them. And so one of the things I think is most interesting is that we were actually able to get the demographic information for more than 50,000 players. So 50,000 players self-reported and gave us this info. And so, for example, overall, we recognize that only 68% of our population, and this is the total of 1 million plays, were actually accurate. But we also got to see some cool patterns, like the ability to do well in the game actually declines right about 60. So it rises until age 60 and then starts to decline. or that the older you are, the longer you take it, so it just takes you longer to make these decisions, or that the average score actually increases with your highest degree obtained, which I think may have been obvious to some people, maybe not. Although it does take PhDs the longest to actually diagnose whether or not it's a real article. And if you're interested in the latest version, I'll drop that in the chat. We've got 70 or so people now watching this, so that's great. And you can just look at the pandemic edition, which I'll drop the link in for you. And Jolt was actually an initiative that we had started several years ago, and it kind of, for me at least, and generally concluded in 2018. I came to the University of Miami, where I'm actually doing curriculum development in this space, trying to help the next generation of communicators actually recognize these patterns. But if you want other examples, I also encourage you, one of the other projects that I'm working on for the Knight Foundation is this journalismgames.org, which lists a variety of news and news-related games, including things on disinformation. That's all I have.
How did you get 1 million views? I think everybody wants to know how you did that.
So there's a bunch of tricks. There are a couple of things that I actually think from a design perspective are really important. Mainly it's about, and people kind of call it like the viral appeal, but it's essentially trying to encourage people to share it because the score means something. So in part of the research that we've been doing beforehand, we went over to BuzzFeed and we looked at all their quizzes and we talked to them about how they're sort of exploiting the nature of people's interest in spreading information like this, and then applied it. Basically said, great, we're gonna give them a score, we're gonna tell them to be competitive, we're gonna include it in all these other contexts, and then the other thing is just good press. NPR picked it up, that really helped, and a couple of others.
And what are some lessons learned in how to get serious games about disinformation into the hands of educators or trainers? If you give your top lesson learned on getting it in the hands of educators.
Sure. My top lesson learned is actually really basic, and it's something that I've been talking about for social impact games for a long time. And this version of the games, this is the second iteration, employs it strongly, which is that because curriculum is so dense, because teachers have so little time, and because it's hard to get people to invest in something that they're not sure about, you need to create bite-sized experiences. So the distinction I perpetually tell people is the person who's willing to sit down and watch a documentary is already committed to your cause. But if you can get them in 30 seconds from a PSA, then you're opening a door that may get them to that long tail version. So I think it's really smart for people who are doing work in this space to, in the very least, create bite-sized, meaningful moments in games that will entice people towards more substantive interactions.
Right. Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah.
All right, let's, Susan from iThrive, hit it. You got a simulation game that is super successful. Can you show us a bit of your game before I ask you some questions?
Absolutely. Let me pull it up here. Hold on. Sorry. All right, is it coming up?
Coming up now, thanks.
All right. So our approach for game designers, we really think about the social emotional skills that we're interested in young people developing to help them make decisions about fake news or accuracy of information. And so the games that we create really thread those social emotional skills throughout what we're up to. Our iThrive simulation is a platform that we created about a year or so ago. We've already received a couple really exciting awards for the platform. And what I want to share with you today is one of the games we've created called Follow the Facts. And this is really focused on a set of media literacy content areas that we think are really important for young people. And we really want to get them involved in really both collaborating around identifying accuracy in news sources, as well as reviewing material and producing their own content. And so in the back, you see the actual platform. This platform delivers information to players, and as part of playing, they have to talk to each other. And so it's not just that they're interacting with the technology, but they have to interact with each other. They have to talk to each other to begin to vet accuracy of sources, factual information, making decisions together about what to report. This is part of our larger civics core library, where we're looking again at social emotional skills as well as civics content. And we really do see media literacy as fitting squarely within, although not exclusively, civics content. Follow the facts in terms of gameplay. They're playing members of the media. They have to get the scoop and report on breaking news. They have to be the first to report, but they also have to be accurate in their reporting. And they need to decide what the public should know during an urgent health crisis and a natural disaster. We pulled on historic events and real world reporting and putting the story together. We have a whole set of learning objectives that we looked at national standards for media literacy learning, and then what would work within the story we were telling. And we constantly went back and forth between game design, what the learning objectives are, and what we were really asking players to do while playing. So throughout the game, they're making decisions, they're reviewing social media that's populated throughout the game. They're getting feedback, both in terms of what they're reporting in the game. Also, there's a public trust meter. So they see written feedback, but they also get rated on the trust that the public is having in their reporting. And they can engage both through the technology with the other reporters in the game. And then there's some canned responses in there based on the different kinds of decisions and reporting that the students do. We've gotten some really fantastic feedback from students. I'll just show you a couple of examples where they're really, because they're really action-oriented around reviewing news and then having to report on it and doing it together, it really is an incredible immersive experience. And because it's timed, they have to respond in a pretty quick way that gives them the experience of, when I'm under stress, when there's urgency, how do I decide what's accurate? How do I understand that? And then just last thing I'll say is that we think of games as tools for learning, that you don't start the game and end the game and are a different person. It's like a learning machine. We create curricula around the game experiences so that teachers can both prepare students to engage in gameplay using, in this game, for example, the CRAP test, which is currency, relevancy, authority, accuracy, and purpose, to evaluate accurate sources. And then in the game, they're sort of testing their understanding of that and deepening it. And then following the lesson, following the gameplay, there's post-sim reflection. So it's really a package that teachers and students can use to really deepen that learning.
Thanks, Susan. What would you say is the most effective way to integrate games with media literacy components like yours into educational curricula? Should they be part of civics, information technology classes, or some other subject? And should they be just standalone conversation starters, or is there a way to build entire units or curricula around that topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interdisciplinary topic, and it could really be aligned in a lot of different places. We're thinking about it with regards to civics teachers. We see a lot of connection there, just given the last couple of years that we've had. But I think it could fit because there's writing in our game and often writing involved. English language arts are great spots for it too. And then a lot of high schools have things like journalism courses, although I don't think you want to specialize too much if we're really looking to elevate the media literacy of all young people, not just those who are engaged in media topics.
And as part of your game, players are confronted with news and social media that they have to take into account in responding to the crisis scenarios. What are some lessons you've learned from your player experiences in terms of how they're influenced by the simulated media that you're feeding them, including there's a trust meter function. Have you seen students sort of exploit the media that they're being fed in order to win the crisis scenario that they're playing?
Not yet. They're really, fascinated and engaging with how, because they're playing reporters, how do you produce accurate news? And what we're seeing a lot of reflection around is this is really hard. There's a lot of conflicting sources out there. Who do we as reporters trust as having the best information? And so we have some NPCs that are from, large corporations, and then there's, the individuals on the street who are sort of experiencing the crisis firsthand. And so they're doing a lot of debating and thinking and really questioning, well, who knows what's going on? Just because you have a bunch of letters behind your name and you're part of a corporation, like they're really questioning that as an authority versus someone who's really seeing things as part of a neighborhood, part of a story.
Right. Thank you, Susan. I've got a few questions for John Cook from Monash University in Australia. John, could you show us quickly your game? Maybe put it up on the screen, whatever you want to show us visually, and then I've got a couple of questions for you about your disinformation game.
Okay, so are you seeing my slides?
Yes, we got them.
Excellent. So my background is cognitive science.
Or we're seeing your screen. We're seeing your primary screen, which has the hop-in. You may need to switch your display to. Whoa, that was cool. Yeah, now it's the
sorry about that.
Spiral of death.
Let's try again. Now the slides are coming up, okay?
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, so my background is cognitive science, and for the last decade, I've been researching how to push back against science misinformation, particularly climate misinformation. And my research has really directed me towards this approach that John Riesenbeck mentioned, logic-based inoculation, which is basically just explaining the techniques of misinformation used to mislead people. The challenge is there are a lot of these. Like, this is just a non-comprehensive landscape of the different techniques of misinformation, and there's a lot. The challenge is trying to communicate those enough to people that they internalize them, so that they can then spot them out in the wild. And games really offer an opportunity to help teach people that. So over the last couple of years, I've been working with the creative agency Autonomy Co-op to develop the Cranky Uncle game. And the goal of the game is to teach people the techniques of science denial using a similar active inoculation approach that John Riesenbeck uses, where a cranky uncle character mentors you in how to become a science-denying cranky uncle yourself. And there's two real elements to the game. Firstly, explaining the techniques of science denial. The cranky uncle goes through, explains each technique, and the game uses a lot of cartoon examples, analogies of those techniques in different situations, both the kind you would actually see in the real world and also absurd, extreme examples. And secondly, the game gets you practicing critical thinking. It shows you examples of misinformation, and the player has to spot the different techniques being used. And the goal of the game is, by practicing these critical thinking exercises, that skill, that difficult skill of spotting reasoning fallacies, misleading techniques, becomes quicker and easier as you get further into the game. So the game uses all those gameplay elements of collecting points, leveling up, to motivate players to get further into the game and become more resilient against misinformation. We've brought the game out on iPhone and Android to make it as accessible as possible, as well as browsers. So basically anyone who has internet access can access the game.
So important. Thank you, James. Sorry, John. I was just looking at the next game. So, John, your game deals specifically with climate change misinformation. What are some lessons learned from your players that might be distinct from how populations interact with other kinds of disinformation? Are people's beliefs and knowledge about science particularly entrenched, particularly polarized? What are some specificities to your climate change and science disinformation?
So there's differences and similarities between climate misinformation and other topics. With climate misinformation, the biggest factor there is political beliefs, particularly the belief that, or the opposition to regulating industry, like the fossil fuel industry. This is the biggest driving factor behind why people reject climate science or believe climate misinformation. But what my research and others' research has found is when you explain the techniques used to mislead people, it works across the political spectrum. And so that tells us that whether people are conservative or liberal, nobody likes being misled. And so logic-based inoculation has this power to neutralize polarizing misinformation. And the other benefit of it is it works across topics. If you inoculate people against climate misinformation, when they see that same technique in, say, vaccine or COVID misinformation, they can still spot that same technique, and you can inoculate them across different topics.
And same kind of question to you, John, is what's the most effective way to integrate this counter disinformation game into educational curricula? What subjects should they be a part of, and is there a way to design entire curricula around games?
Before I was working on games, I was working on misconception-based learning, which is a teaching approach that teaches science by directly addressing misconceptions about science. And there's several decades of research that have found that it's one of the most powerful ways of teaching science. And serious games addressing misinformation are a perfect educational resource for this teaching approach. So we've begun integrating it into existing curriculum that we've developed that use misconception-based learning. And the one thing that surprised me has been seeing the range of subjects that have started adopting the Cranky Uncle game in their classroom. I originally thought of it as environmental science or maybe even just science in general, but was surprised to see it being used in English classes, geography, philosophy, civics, a whole range of subjects. Really any subject that has misinformation in it, which is every subject.
Thanks, John. Last and certainly not least, we have James, CEO, founder, Endemic Creations, which is pretty much the most popular serious game that I can think of since like Oregon Trail or Odell Lake, if anyone remembers that. So James, I'm just gonna ask you straight up, how did you do it? How did you make a game that's both viral, commercially successful, and also educational? Was the educational value of Plague Inc. and the fake news mod of it, were those educational objectives top of mind when you designed your games?
No, absolutely not. I think that's a key thing that I was thinking is a big difference between me and the rest of the speakers, is that we've kind of got to the same place, but we've come from the opposite direction. So for people who don't know, so I made originally, almost 10 years ago now, a game called Plague Inc., which very popular, 160 million players. People infect the world with a deadly disease, particularly topical at the moment, obviously with COVID, and we've been working with the WHO to make a Plague Inc. the Cure version, which lets people interact around with lockdowns and understand more about it. So that's kind of a separate educational game aspect. But so I made Plague Inc. I've made another game, Rebel Inc., which is about simulating insurgency in Afghanistan. But with all of these games, we aim to make something fun. I made it as a hobby originally, to something I wanted to make, and then we've seen people get educated by accident. That was the topic of a talk I did at Games for Change a few years ago. Once you've got this kind of platform of a game which is interesting and can engage people, we've then been able to create sort of different versions of it, new add-ons to it, and one of those is our fake news update, which I guess is the reason why I got asked to go onto this panel. But no, definitely not intending to be educational. But because it's based on real world data, real world science, it informs people anyway. Potentially not to the degree which a lot of the other games that have been discussed do, but it's a powerful I think often games are a wonderful way to sort of just introduce a topic or get people thinking about a topic, and then they can go and find out more about the subject later on. I think it kind of touched on what Lindsay said about creating bite-sized experiences for people to then sort of use that as a stepping stone to go and get something else later.
And so you mentioned you have different versions of your game. You have one where you're combating a virus, one where you're spreading a virus, a real virus. Are there any notable differences that you've seen in the way that players interact with viral disinformation through your game, as compared with the way they interact with the real virus scenarios of plaguing?
Well, so originally I made the fake news version because I think it was coming up to the UK elections, and so fake news was a particularly hot topic then. And I got in touch with a charity who combats it here called Full Fact, and I sort of said to them, "Hey, we love what you do. We sort of supported them financially, but we want to help try and sort of can we use our game to help inform people?" And I realized very rapidly that there were distressingly a lot of similarities between an infectious disease spreading around and disinformation or fake news. All of the core algorithms, the core concepts of an infectious disease spreading around had clear mappings with the disinformation, the fake news scenario that we added to the game. So instead of people being infected and then dying or recovering, instead we have people who are either become deceived by the fake news or they become informed and they realize it's fake news. So the whole game is about turning people into well, as a player in Plague Inc, you're typically the bad guy. You're trying to turn people to be deceived. You create a certain type of fake news. You decide who it's created by, who it's blaming. Is it and then from there you can expand it via various means. You're trying to boost its virality. You're trying to boost its plausibility. You're trying to develop a community about it. That was one thing when I was chatting with the Full Fact people, was the importance they're saying of a community. If you can foster a community around your misinformation, about your conspiracy theory, it's so much harder to dislodge. So we try to weave that into the thread of the game. And if we have fact checkers who are trying to stamp it out and stuff. But so we've sent around 1.5 million people to the Full Fact website and to the PolitiFact website from inside the game. So when people finish playing a game, they can choose to press a button to find out more about it, to understand how it works in real life and things they can be careful of. So although we're not there to kind of do the core education, we can try and funnel people over to the experts who can hopefully do a better job of giving the specific information that they need, or specific bits of disinformation that might need to be countered.
Awesome. Thank you, James. Thanks for sharing that experience. We have a couple of good questions from our audience. I'm going to ask the first one. I guess for anyone on the panel can answer this. Do you think the impact of the games comes from playing them, from the discussions that they provoke? If it's the latter, if it's discussions, how do you help teachers or students engage in good decisions post-game? Does anyone want to take that first? Maybe starting at the beginning, maybe John. Does the biggest impact come from playing the game, you think, or from discussions they provoke? Or maybe if anyone else wants to answer, if you don't want to, John.
It's a really difficult question. I would say both, but primarily from playing it, I think. Although discussing it and talking about it also contributes to its popularity, of course. But it's so if you like, there is kind of such a thing as like a second-hand inoculation, which in the literature is referred to as post-inoculation talk. But it's a little bit of a wishy-washy concept in many regards. So I'm not as convinced of its scientific validity as I am of the inoculation.
From a very
itself.
non-scientific point of view, I think that if a game is is encouraging thoughts and stuff through playing, you're more likely to want to talk about it. I mean, I think both of them are very important. Like you want people to kind of, even if nothing else, talk about it in their mind later. With our games, we see people mulling over, oh, wait a minute, what if I did this a bit differently? Or they go and talk to a friend who knows more about it and say, hey, what do you think I should have done? Anything that can kind of encourage that kind of thought process in your head or with other people is very powerful, I think. And if the game's not doing that, then potentially there's a problem with the game's goals if it's not triggering that.
Yeah, I think it's important to think of it as a package that, at least for us in our work, teachers need support, and many teachers need support in thinking about how to integrate games as tools into their classroom. And, we have discussion guides and tips and pointers that we offer to teachers as part of it. But I really think of it as a whole package, that games are a tool to get excited, engaged, interested. And I totally agree, James, the best game you're going to want to talk about regardless. You're going to have so much to say, want to know about other people's experiences. And so weaving that in across the learning goals is
one of the
really
things that
impactful.
has impressed me has been the really creative ways that teachers have taken that active inoculation approach and applied it in classroom activities. 2 examples are role-playing, where you divide the students up into groups and have them have a conversation where one student is like the cranky uncle and the other is trying to, for example, convince them of climate change. And you can learn from both roles, either trying to respond to misinformation or even try to use, as a cranky uncle, try to use those fallacies from the game. That teaches you, and it inoculates you against them by using them. And the other very cool assignment was having students try to use misleading techniques in an assignment. One that Melanie Tressett-King did from Massachusetts was she had the students write a "Please Don't Fail Me" assignment, where the students had to use like 3 fallacies from the game to argue that they shouldn't be failed in their class, even though they didn't study at all. And it was both a great example of active inoculation, but also hilarious. The submitted assignments were just...
A quick designer perspective, I think that the core concept for us, at least, is often whether or not we're having them practice or witness. And so I think that good design is often actively doing both. So there are things that you may want them to practice, but it's really fun. So in the context of games like Play Spent, where people get really frustrated and say you can't win to the player as onlookers, there's a whole sort of tradition where there's efficacy to be had as spectator as well as efficacy to be had for player. We tend to bias towards player, but I think spectator's got all kinds of potential that we often don't design toward, but need to.
Cool. Another question we got, more of a practical question for devs, I guess, is how do you go about deciding when to update your game with new information? I guess I would refine that to say, like, what priorities determine whether you're going to update the content of your game when it's topical, like Factitious, like bad news, like cranky uncles probably got science changing all the time, or James. I mean, your game is large. It's uses really resource intense assets. How do you prioritize updates to games?
I'll give the answer no one wants to hear, which is budget and pipeline. I think it's really important that people recognize that they make the simplest pipeline they can. So we actually developed a pipeline tool so that journalists could do the work of inputting data instead of trying to get our devs involved. So we have detached them, but ultimately budget's what's preventing Factitious from continuing. So you'll notice that not all the versions are still up, and that's because the grant money's gone.
Having a plan to get content in without having to go through all the tech side of things is very powerful and so worth doing early on. That's one of the things I say to people more than anything else, actually, when they ask me for advice when they're starting up something. It's so hard to change a single sentence in a game normally, but if you've designed in it from the beginning, with our games, we have the ability, I can just change a line of code in a website and it will go all the way through. You could have it just pull it straight from a Google Sheet every time if you don't want anything to get. Once it's in a reads from a Google Sheet, like, you never need to speak to the nasty, expensive tech person again. You can sit there in your room and just whack out a sentence or two. Like it can, some of the ways that plaguing went viral in the early days was we have custom news headlines, which we sort of make vaguely witty, humorous sort of commentary on what's going on in the world at the moment. And those kind of news headlines, we can change those with a click of a finger in real time. And that was a very powerful way to get us onto the front page of Reddit again and again and again. So yeah, definitely worth, if you can, think about it. Worth sort of thinking about that at the beginning.
And that perspective also avails you of the opportunity for user-generated content, which can really help sustain you and get you toward that evergreen state, if you can editorialize it appropriately.
Well, I guess it also depends a bit on what the goal is for the game or tool, because it's very tempting to say, yes, this is going to be the game or tool that lasts for 100 years and is going to be the authority on everything. But actually, it's fucking hard to even get to do it for like something that's relevant for this precise moment in time. And actually, so maybe it's better to focus on something that really works now rather than something that's a bit whiffly and generic. So, I mean, my Rebelink game based on Afghanistan, all the stuff that's going on in Afghanistan at the moment is devastatingly sad and distressing to see. And my game is feeling less and less accurate in that regard. The game's gone into a lose state kind of permanently. The real life has gone into a lose state permanently, which my game never anticipated. So I guess maybe you have to accept sometimes it goes a bit obsolete.
I think we got time for one more question in 1 minute or less. What have your games taught you about what media organizations can do to combat disinformation without spending a lot of time on building up their own reach? What's a way to gamify the combating of disinformation that media organizations might use?
I mean, I think you should be sort of going back to the fact-checking organizations who really focus on it the whole time. Like they're raising funding, they've got grants. Like, so we send people to PolitiFact and in the US, Full Fact in the UK. Like, these guys are hopefully already squashing a lot of the big disinformation. So in a way, I'd personally go for the experts on it rather than try to sort of do it as well. I don't know if that's quite answering the question though.
One of my collaborations is with a media professor from West Virginia University, Jasper Fessman, and what he's trying to do, teaching journalists coming up into the industry, is inoculate them against the techniques of misinformation, because he finds journalists often get gamed by misinformation sources into amplifying their misinformation. So we're working on interventions like that can help inoculate the journalists themselves, so that they're not contributing to the spread of misinformation.
One journalist saved is worth sort of 100 normal people, maybe.
Since we've only got like 30 seconds left before Raul kicks us out, I want to encourage all of our presenters to put their contact information in the chat box so that our viewers can contact any or all of us, thanks Raul, with any of their questions. There are some good ones that just came out, and of course, the best discussion happens at the end when we all start like improvising. So that doesn't leave us that much time, but I will put mine in here as well. And let's say, are you serious, Raul? You won't kick anyone out? Like, should we just keep talking until the session dissolves into something else and we all just go poof?
I need to go to bed. It's very late over here. I'm going to get on too long.
Yeah. So
yeah, Dave, it's pushing 1:30 or 12:30.
That's right. And John, it's like yesterday for you or something because of the way the globe works.
I'm about to have breakfast actually.
He's ahead.
Thank you so much to our presenters, James, Susan, John Cook, Lindsay. I'm gonna stay in the chat to just copy down notes, and if anyone wants to ask me anything, go ahead. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Raul, for producing it. And please feel free, everyone, to reach out over email to any of the presenters with any additional questions. This has been Tyler from the GEC.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys. Have a great day.
Bye,
Thanks
everyone.
for having me.